Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 131, Knowledge is Power. Breakfast had run a bit late, and Robert was more than willing to brag about how to get a golden body. Plus, he had shared some of the methods that they could try, and they all heard of a few methods that sounded interesting. Apparently, there wasn't just one path to power, and it was only when going beyond gold that someone would have to undergo a special encounter to achieve it. Everyone in this village was stuck at gold, and he said that there were maybe 5 people above it in the entire world. The methods that interested them were either through physical trials or absorption. They had potions that could improve a person's body to gold, but they were extremely toxic and would permanently damage the body if someone failed. Honestly, that sounded perfect for MASH, even it took several weeks to accomplish the improvement. His skills should make it so that potions wouldn't be able to harm him, as one of his skills removed the negative effects of things he consumed. It would mean that he would need to start ASAP and would need to stay in the dungeon for at least 1 week and up to 1 month. It depended on how close to gold he already was. MASH imagined he was pretty close if there was a connection to stats, but he didn't really know. The other 3 didn't have as easy methods. They could risk the medicine too, but it was too much of a risk. Robert had some training methods that would work too, although that would still take a year or 2 to accomplish. MASH would feel bad for them, but he remembered how bored Jill had acted and decided that it would be fine. They could spend years training, he would take his shortcuts. Especially since Robert had told him that his family could get him the potions if he wanted to try that method. MASH had needed to explain his immunity to consumed potions, and that had seriously surprised the man. It turned out that was a common secondary gift. Reaching gold was not easy, but most fighters achieved it within their lifespan, and many people tried using the potions. Even after talking to Robert, they didn't immediately focus on training. They decided that could complete multiple tasks at once and went to the library to learn what they could on their own. There might be more information on the powers of this world, but would also help them in learning anything about the dungeon. Robert had informed them that the servant his father had captured provided some very convincing evidence. The demons are more invasive and widespread than initially believed, however, he didn't know why they were here. It sounded like the demons were led here, though they didn't know by who or why. MASH's best guess was that the dungeon wanted them to figure out why the demons were in the village, and deal with it. To that end, Red suggested they try and find out what significance the village has, and why someone would attack it. The Lord believed it had to do with his daughter's inauspicious birth, but they didn't know what exactly that meant. There was a lot of general information that they needed to find out, and the library would be a good place for that. The library was actually within the mansion, and not a public destination in the village. They didn't actually ask a servant for directions, as Red would be expected to know where the room was. They spent a few minutes searching for it but managed to find it fairly easily. His domain let him look into rooms and the library was very noticeable. Entering the room, MASH quickly grew excited. Initially, he expected a personal library to be fairly small, but he was pleased to see that he was wrong. Dozens of shelves were filled with books and there were even some piles of books along the ground. Searching through all of these would take far too long, and they got started immediately. They split up the library into sections, and each of them covered a quarter of the books. They split their objectives into different priorities, and the top of that list was learning of the powers here. While clearing the dungeon was still important, they weren't trying to rush it. Plus, so long as they were here, they could continue to help the people when they needed it. They all wanted to learn what they could, as several of the things they had seen had been very interesting. Gaining magic abilities and new power was what MASH had focused on, but the others had been similarly interested by some of the technology here. One of the things Jill was hoping to find out about, was a device that moved on its own. It didn't require any mana, and anyone could use it. She had learned of it from Rebecca, who had talked about it, when telling them of news from the capital. MASH hadn't considered learning things outside of gaining power, and he chastised himself for his narrow-mindedness. It turned out that he wasn't being greedy enough. The others had the right of it, he should be trying to learn everything he could. Their second priority was the dungeon, and MASH made sure to grab any books that mentioned history. After grabbing everything that interested him, he was left with hundreds of books. Maybe, he was being over-ambitious, but he might as well read as much as he could. However, he couldn't stop his greed, and the first book he started with was about their gifts. Despite his ability to gain powers, he wanted to know if he could also get gifts. They spent most of the day in the library and were surprised when a servant came to grab them for dinner. They had missed lunch, and the servant explained that they could bring food to the library if they wanted. Jill immediately accepted, and Red got chastised for not doing her work properly. Luke covered for her, telling the servant that he had requested her help searching through the books. Mash thought about what he had read. The book on gifts had been extremely enlightening, and he wasn't sure he could get one even if he wanted. Apparently, it only worked for humans, and Mash wasn't sure if he qualified. He would tell the others and at least try to receive one, but he didn't have high hopes for himself. Jill and Luke, on the other hand, could try and receive one. Gifts were always a good thing, though most were extremely minor, and some sounded useless. Many gifts offered new ways to perceive the world, improving things like sight and hearing. There were a few more substantial ones like the ones the twins had shown, but most fell into the barely useful category. According to the journal he had read the other day, Mash's original gift had been an improved sense of touch, which was widely considered to be one of the most useless gifts. The book had listed some of them according to superficial rankings, and that was one that fell near the bottom. He saw the manipulation of hair among those at the bottom and realized how subjective the list really was. Having seen the power of hair magic at the arena, Mash believed it should have been placed higher. To get a gift, they would need to enter what was known as a sanctuary. It was a place where their god had descended in the past. Their god's passing was enough to saturate the land with power and blessings, and it fell upon the people to prove themselves worthy to receive it. A person could only take a trial for a gift once every 5 years, and he was certain that they would all try and get one. Even if it didn't work, they would at least take the chance. Mash was curious to hear about what the others had read up on but wanted to do it privately. He followed the servant into a dining hall and was surprised to see the head of the household sitting at the table. He was with Edward, but his other children weren't present. Mash took a seat and wanted to start eating. As they got closer to the room, his hunger had sprung up. It had been forgotten in his excitement, though that was passing now. "Welcome. What have you all been studying?" He narrowed his eyes at Red in particular, but Jill was the one to speak. She had been taking charge of most discussions, and none of them minded as she was obviously the most comfortable in those situations. Plus, she didn't have a problematic appearance. "Luke and I wish to protect the people for a short while and have been looking into why the demons are here, and more information on them. Although we may have gotten a bit distracted when browsing your collection. Thankfully, Mash and Ellie had decided to join us, and their aid has been greatly appreciated." She spoke somewhat formally, and Mash guessed that she had learned of the proper way to speak to nobility. Edward responded to Jill's statement, hesitation filling his voice. "Did you foresee something? Do you need my help? I'm sure my clones could speed up the process." He was clearly alarmed, and Mash understood why. Jill's arrival at the village had been a huge boon but had also revealed something big. Essentially, she was currently occupying the position he usually had, and Edward was treating her like she would know of anything crazy that was coming. "No, it isn't that urgent as of yet, however, if I think we need your help, I will seek you out. However, I would appreciate it if you could keep me up to date on anything you find out." Edward nodded his and looked like he wanted to say more, but his father stopped him. "Thank you for your help, but let us move to lighter topics while we eat." Everyone agreed with that, and the meal began in earnest. Mash was pleased, eating the strangely sweet stew. Mash wondered if everything here was sweet, as most of the dishes he had were on the sweeter side. It wasn't a complaint as he enjoyed sweet foods, but he decided he would look at a recipe book later. The rest of the meal went by quickly, and at the end, he was told that the potions he wanted were ready. They had prepared enough for a month, so he could get started whenever he wanted. Mash was excited and didn't waste any time, though the servant had tried to warn him to wait until his food had fully digested. The servant explained that the process would be painful, and he might throw up if he did so. Mash could handle some pain and mostly ignored the warning. His friends stuck around though, looking at him with a bit of jealousy. He rolled his eyes and remembered to tell them about gifts and what he had learned. That appeased their jealousy greatly, and Luke and Jill were tempted to go to the sanctuary right away. He wanted to laugh at their flip-flopping attitudes but settled on telling them that they might all be able to get a gift and they could go in the morning. They agreed but pushed Mash to get it over with. Before Mash got started, Coraline entered the room, apparently having learned of what was happening. At first, she asked him why he would do this, and he explained again about his immunity to harm from things he consumed. She seemed offended more than worried now, as it probably felt like he was keeping a secret from her. Well, there wasn't much he could do about it unless he was willing to reveal the whole truth to her. That still felt like a bad idea, and he merely apologized to her. Now, that all the distractions were dealt with, Mash eagerly picked up one of the potion vials. They were in this strange glass tube, and it was sealed by a wooden cork. Mash pulled it off easily and downed the potion, not really worried about the consequences. It was a lot thicker than he expected and found that it was sweet like everything else. He swallowed it, in one fluid motion, and felt it as it traveled through his throat. It didn't really feel like much at first, but that changed after a moment. Chapter 132, Trials. His body felt cold as though the strange potion was drawing in all of his body heat. It didn't hurt, but it wasn't pleasant either. He told Priscilla to check his body and make sure that nothing harmful was happening. It shouldn't be possible according to his skill, but he was still a little worried considering this potion was otherworldly. This is strange, it's changing your body. I don't know what is happening, though it doesn't seem to be harmful. Mash agreed with her, as he could somewhat follow the mana of the potion with his draconic domain. It seemed to dissolve and spread through his body, mixing with his skin and bones. Somehow, the potion spread to his entire body, though it didn't actually feel like it did anything other than making him a bit colder. I think that's it. Everyone in the room just stared at him, and they seemed a bit dissatisfied. Mash felt much the same as his body seemed unchanged. Coraline looked at him for a second and nodded to him before leaving. Once she had left, he was going to prepare to head back to the library. Check your status. You really need to remember to do that. Red sounded like she was talking to a child, and Mash winced as he remembered to do that. It really should be something he used as a skill, but he always seemed to forget about it. Unsurprisingly, his status was mostly unchanged, however, he did notice one difference. Name, Mash Stellumbra Class, Draconic Thunderwood Imitation. Level, 78. Health, 1800/1800. Energy, 3110/3110. Trial of the Golden Body. 4/10. The final thing he received, even after all of his skills, was something new. Trial of the Golden Body sounded like exactly what he was looking for. While his skills and attributes were unchanged, seeing the system adapt to the potion was a bit jarring. How did the class system work that it could include foreign things like this, and why didn't his marks show up? Both of them provided some benefits, and he wondered why those effects didn't show up here. I got something called Trial of the Golden Body, and it's almost half done already. I think it included where my body was already at. I don't think it relates to stats as much as we initially believed, otherwise I think I would be a lot closer to finishing. He tried to explain what he could, and he wished Luna was around to check his body with more detail. Luke walked over speaking, as he reached for Mash. Let me check, maybe I can see what's happening. Nodding towards him, Mash held his arm out for Luke. Luke's mana entered his body and dissolved in a similar way to the potion, however it returned to him after a short period of time. He rubbed his chin for a second before explaining. I think it is strengthening your body in relation to your soul, or maybe it's the other way around. There are changes happening to make them line up. That explanation was obviously a bit lacking, and Mash asked him to expand on what he meant. After talking for a little bit longer, they couldn't really come up with any more insights. It was late by the time they finished, and Mash decided he could just head to bed. He didn't get to sleep last night and wanted to get some tonight. As his friends left his room, he was surprised to realize that his day had been uneventful. He had talked with his friends and learned a good bit, but he hadn't had to fight anything. Nobody even got hurt, and he wondered how long it had been since he last had a day like that. Tomorrow wouldn't be the same, as they were planning on going to the sanctuary. He didn't think that getting a gift would be easy, although he wasn't worried about getting too hurt. The trials here weren't actually life-threatening, and most trials didn't involve any kind of combat. Apparently, there were a few, but even those would end before someone took serious harm. God was extremely generous in this world. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, but decided that it was better than having to kill for power. That night he went to sleep early, feeling surprisingly good as he did so. He felt even better when he woke up in the morning, and he didn't even need to use inhuman hibernation to wash away his fatigue. He wondered what could have caused it and remembered the potion. That was the only thing he had done differently, and hoped that the effect would happen again tonight. Looking out his window, he saw that it was fairly early in the morning. However, the sun was out, and he figured it would be fine to wake the others. They were probably just as excited as he was to try and get a gift. He was right, as most of the others were already awake. Red was the only one who was still asleep, and Jill actually had to teleport into her room to wake her up. Red got a room like the other servants, and while it was somewhat extravagant, it was much worse than the one that he was using. Her room was close to Rebecca's though, and Mash wondered how her duties as a servant were going. Once she woke up, they told a servant that they were heading out for a bit. They had made up an excuse, claiming that some of them wanted to try and take another trial. The servant didn't seem bothered and told them where they would need to go. After informing their hosts, Mash left a wooden copy of Priscilla in his room. He used his treant form to make it so that he wouldn't need to worry about using his energy to support. They left soon after, heading for the sanctuary. It was opposite the village, and they found it fairly easily. They walked along the river and noticed a wide area where the trees were taller, and the grass was riddled with small flowers. The flowers were oddly purple, and the area stood out from its surroundings. The rest of the area was a grass plain with the occasional tree, and he had noticed a few white flowers during the journey. He had expected them to hide the sanctuary, though he guessed that there was no real reason to hide it. If the book was right, then only humans would be able to receive a gift. As they got closer to the sanctuary, Mash could feel it within his domain. Or rather he couldn't feel anything, which meant that it was probably a domain similar to his own skill. It seemed like the god here had a similar ability to the ones back in their world. That interested Mash, and he told the others the same. What was surprising was the decrease in mana density as they approached the space. Normally, a place like this would have more mana, and the feeling was jarring. Mash stopped at the edge of the boundary, and he looked at the others. Red and Luke stopped, but Jill just kept walking. As soon as she stepped inside, she vanished, purple smoke appearing where she had been. He couldn't see her with his domain and hadn't even felt anything happen. She entered with complete confidence, and Mash grew a little worried for her. He knew that she had a lot of things to help her stay safe and could even see the future in a strange way, but he still thought that she was getting overconfident. This place was supposedly made by a god, and a being like that would be hundreds of levels above them. I'll try and talk to her afterward. Red spoke, sounding very annoyed. For his part, he was just glad that someone else volunteered for the position. Mash probably wouldn't be a very good choice for lecturing someone on not doing something dangerous. His very being was dangerous at this point, and he constantly seemed to rush into even greater danger. Even if he didn't want it, he knew that he couldn't avoid it. Believing anything else would just be stupid. After Red finished speaking, she stepped into the sanctuary too. She vanished similarly too, and then it was just Luke and Mash. Luke clapped the back of Mash's shoulder before entering himself. Once the purple smoke finally dispersed, Mash himself stepped in. He couldn't help but let out a sigh as he entered. Everything was covered in darkness for a second, and then Mash found himself in a room of some kind. There were no walls in the room, and it was completely empty. Looking around, it seemed like the room stretched out endlessly. He didn't feel any breeze, and there were no sounds or smells either. The room was totally empty though it wasn't dark. The floor was white, and it sprawled in every direction. Bending over he ran his hands against the floor and was surprised to feel that it was perfectly smooth. It was perfectly flat. Out of curiosity, he punched the ground. He could easily break stone with his fist, though the floor didn't even seem to budge. Mash was pretty confused and decided that he was just wasting time. Well, there was no point in sitting around and he started walking in a direction. He left a trail of wood behind him to make sure that he kept walking straight. It was a small insurance, but it was enough for him to feel comfortable. Starting to walk, he quickly grew annoyed. There was literally nothing in the room, and if not for Priscilla he would have been extremely bored. With Priscilla around, he was able to practice his telepathy and had managed to distract himself. He couldn't really tell how much time had passed but knew that it had already been several hours. Feeling a little hungry, Mash opened up his storage space and grabbed some of his rations. He had stocked up on pieces of bread, cheeses, and dried meats. He made several sandwiches and munched on them as he waited for something to change. Nothing happened, and after a while, he decided to continue walking. Before the day passed, he sat down and took another potion. They had given him all the doses he would need at the start, and he stored it in his storage space. Having that with him was very relieving, as it made it feel like he was making some progress. He knew when a day had passed. After the first few hours, he told Priscilla to start counting. She was better at multitasking than Mash and would be able to do something as simple as counting without much effort. All he really wanted to do was make sure he had some reference for time. He still had plenty of rations and ate them whenever he felt like he needed to. Although, he was worried about the others. Not so much about lacking food, but he was worried that they would have already finished. He wondered what they were up to and just kept walking. A few times he had tried breaking the space and freeing himself. The only thing he had really gained was time, as he had already drunk a few more of the potions. Using the potions had helped him tell how much time had passed, although he couldn't hide his excitement. He was worried about escaping, but as he kept an eye on his status, he was pleased to see how far he had gotten. He expected that he would only need 1 or 2 more potions before achieving gold. He grew more anxious as 10 days passed, and he wondered if he would be trapped in here forever. Although, he dismissed the thought, remembering that these trials were supposed to be harmless. He assumed that if he was ever really in trouble of starving, God would free him. With all the time he had, Mash continued to work on his telepathy and was at the point where he could send and receive thoughts. Reading people's minds was difficult, but he could get a general idea of what someone was thinking now. He had actually managed to raise his wisdom a bit too, and he guessed that he would reach a golden body after today. Checking his status, he checked his attributes before making the change. Name, Mash Stell Lumber Class, Draconic Thunderwood Imitation. Level, 78. Health, 1800/1800. Energy, 3110/3110. Wisdom, 90-92. Trial of the Golden Body. 9/10. Chapter 133, Golden Gift. Mash didn't know what to expect from getting the gold body, but he had been able to observe what the potion was doing to a small degree. As Luke had said, the substance had bled into his body and had actually been affecting it as a whole. He had noticed it mixing with his energy and even some odd things like his hair. He didn't really understand what was happening but knew that the potion was stuffing him with energy. What was more interesting was the fact that he could tell. His draconic domain let him get an idea of how close he was getting to his body's limit. He was curious to see what exactly would happen when he went over that limit. He expected that the next potion would be enough and was debating whether or not to give up on the trial. If something went wrong with the process, then he would regret not having Luke around. However, he could heal himself with inhuman hibernation, so long as it didn't literally kill him. That was enough a reason not to worry too much, and he sat down and prepared to drink the final potion. It wasn't the last of his reserves as he still had several more potions. He had been given enough to last a month, and he had only spent just over 10 days in the dungeon. Taking out another potion, he uncorked it feeling the oddly cool glass in his hand. It had been interesting to feel the glass, as it felt like it had been chilled by the potion. Furthermore, the color of this potion had changed when he had taken it out. Before it had been a mix of reds and oranges, but this one had turned oddly purple. Confused, he grabbed another one from his space and paid special attention to it as he did so. When his hand touched the vial, he saw the potion change colors. Even odder was how the color returned to normal when he let it go. Was it a part of the trial, or maybe it was just meant to happen when someone was at their breakthrough? He didn't know but guessed that it would be all right. There was time for caution, but he was far too excited to be that careful. Instead, he was just wanted to see what getting a golden body would entail. With that in mind, he drank the now purple potion. It felt oddly thick as he drank it, and it was a lot colder now. It was so cold that he felt his teeth sting a little as he drank it. If not for his skill, he thought that it would hurt him just by freezing his insides. It didn't hurt though, and he managed to swallow it. The cold spread through his body and went deeper this time. It seemed to sink into something beyond his body, and he felt like something broke inside of him. However, instead of pain, it had been like the breaking of a dam, and energy flooded his body. In an instant, he knew that something had changed. His body had become different, and even without checking his appearance, he expected that there would be a change to his appearance. He couldn't currently check his real appearance, but he could tell. One of the things that he did notice was the change in his hair. It was longer, and he could feel it on his forehead. Forming a blade out of wood, he tried cutting his hair, only to find that it wouldn't cut. At least not as easily as it had before. He could manage with a bit more force but decided to hold off on that. Instead, he would wait until he could see what he was doing. His domain would let him see the shape, but he wanted to get a better grasp of his appearance before doing so. Remembering to check his status instead of just relying on his skills, he focused inwards. He was curious to see what improvements he had made. Plus, he wanted to know if the changes would even be recorded by the class system. Name, Mash Stell Lumber Class, Draconic Thunderwood Imitation. Level, 78. Health, 2000/2000. Energy, 3510/3510. Fortitude, 180/200. Endurance, 111/131. Strength, 130/150. Agility, 150/170. Intelligence, 200/220. Wisdom, 90/112. Charisma, 76/96. Free stats, 0. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Monstrous Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Draconic Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Monstrous Humanity, Wooden Body, Mimics Avarice, Golden Body. Draconic Domain, passive. Your eyes just weren't enough. Sense the changes in the mana around you. Connect to the mana in your space and inherently understand the nature of the mana. Your presence suffuses the space, weakens the magic of enemies beneath you. Current range, 21-23 feet. Adaptable Monster Core, passive and unnatural mana core has fundamentally altered your body. Fusion with a monster has given you access to its potential. Stamina and mana combine to become energy. Your monstrous body is better able to handle the changes to your core. Current bonus, plus 50% plus 75% efficiency. Golden Body, passive. Having soul in the techniques of another world, your body evolves beyond its old limitations. However, even this transformation is incomplete. Seek out the next step and truly make this power your own. Trial of the True Body, 0/100. Well, he couldn't say that he expected to see any changes, but he was pleasantly surprised by the benefits. All of his stats had gone up by 20, and that alone was impressive. Plus, his energy had gotten more effective. That alone would have been a significant improvement, and the attributes just felt like a bonus. The actual change was represented as a skill too, though it was very vague. Plus, it implied that he wasn't anywhere near done. Even going so far as to give him another trial immediately, and this one wasn't partially complete. He guessed that meant that it didn't have anything to do with his attributes, and probably required some other qualities. He didn't really know how to get started with that and decided to move on. He wanted to test the new capabilities of his body. When he finished checking his status, he practiced moving his body a little. It took a few minutes, but he got used to changes pretty quickly. His skills usually boosted him far past the normal limits, and this improvement only made him want for more. It still felt lacking in comparison to his usual abilities. Plus, he was in a space where he could test dragon form without real complications. Even more than the stats and improvements to his energy, he was curious to see if the changes to his body affected his transformations. His instincts told him that it would, and he wanted to see if he could break himself out of this space. He stopped when he felt a hand fall upon his shoulder. It was large, big enough easily cover his entire side. Slowly, he turned his head, surprised to feel the man appear in his draconic domain. It had just happened, and there had been no previous indication. Even now it didn't feel like there was a person within his domain. Although the man was certainly human, Mash couldn't help but feel like he was in the presence of a dragon. His eyes were similar to Mash's own, slit-like pupils surrounded by darkness. However, the man's pupils were red instead of his white. They shared the same glow though, and Mash didn't think he was looking at a human anymore. "Hello, child, what is one my own doing taking this trial? This was meant for humans." The voice was deep and the whole place seemed to rumble with each word. Mash felt a primal fear as he noticed the tinge of anger in the man's voice. Slowly, he processed what the man had said, and he thought furiously for a response. "I am human. I think the thing you're sensing is from..." Mash trailed off, hesitating to explain that he had gotten his abilities from eating dragon flesh. Looking at the man, he grew more apprehensive. The man didn't wear armor, instead, he wore what looked like a pristine suit. It was made of pure flames, and his presence kept getting more intense for a second. Sweat was building on Mash's forehead and he thought about his escape plans. Priscilla was already preparing a dozen outlines, all of which he knew wouldn't manage to even inconvenience the man. Then the pressure that had been building vanished, and the men let out a deep full belly laugh. "Ha! You can relax, boy, I'm well aware of what you are, I just rarely get to speak with one of my own. I couldn't miss the opportunity. And before you ask, you are one of my kind. You have made our power your own, and that makes you one of us. It should be the same regardless of who you meet." The man sounded normal, but that didn't let Mash relax in the slightest. He was also too busy trying to understand his words to relax properly. Was Mash really a dragon? It was one thing to pretend to be one, but it sounded like he would really be considered one. If a real dragon treated him like one of his kind, then who was he to argue? Trying to figure out what to say, he struggled to come up with a response. What is happening? The man let out another loud laugh, and his response came a lot quicker than before. Don't lie to me, I could tell you planned on breaking my trial. And that is quite rude, may I add. Especially after I gave you so much time to reach a golden body. Congratulations on completing the trial, however, I have no gifts for someone who is not human. Just take your time here as the reward. Plus, all your friends look like they will receive a gift. Thinking about what the man was saying, Mash couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. All this time had been wasted, and he wouldn't even get a gift for it. Then a realization hit him, the others still hadn't finished their trial. Mash was a little apprehensive to ask a god more mundane questions and was trying to figure out a better way to word his thoughts. I told you, you didn't need to worry so much. Your friends have only been in the trial for a day or so. You too in reality. Since you weren't able to receive a real reward, and I don't get to see my family very often, I decided to give you a little reward of your own time and that small hint towards how to get your next body. The god was surprisingly nice, though he guessed that most gods were supposed to be kind. Apparently, he had already received his reward, and it seemed like the trial itself was a part of the reward. Although he had no idea about what the hint was, he would work on figuring that part out. More importantly, he needed to thank the god, but also bring up another topic. Thank you for everything, but can you tell me how I can free the people in the town? This world is being altered and there are people suffering because of it. If anyone would know how to free the people, it would be their god. At least, that was what Mash was hoping for. He waited for a response, and he worried that he had done something wrong after the silence had carried for a bit. Finally, the deity gave him a response. There is little you can do for the whole world, though you might be able to save a few. Let me share with you one of the curses of this world. The knowledge of what lays beyond your struggle. Now, those words were something Mash expected from a god. He would make sure to learn all he could from the amiable being. Chapter 134, The Greater Worlds. Mash listened carefully, knowing that this situation was probably not going to happen again. The god was far friendlier than he expected and speaking to him would be enlightening. Plus, he was desperate to learn of the dungeons, and what they were for. The unnamed god still frightened him a little, but he managed to push through the apprehension. Before I get started, tell me what you know of dungeons. Hearing the god's words, Mash nodded and began sharing what he knew. He explained how he knew that worlds had owners, and they could somehow make dungeons. However, there was another way for dungeons to form, and he assumed that it was natural, but didn't actually know. After he made a few more comments, the god cut him off and continued where he had left off. Good, you seem to have some of the basics at least. However, I am surprised you know of the owners. Hearing the speculation in the god's voice, Mash was eager to share his experiences. Any insights he could get into the marks, or their purpose would be incredible. Furthermore, his information might help him find the owner of his own world. The chance wasn't great, as Mash didn't think that the god was stronger than the owners. In fact, none of the people he had met could compare to the world carrier. There was something to say about the power of size, and a creature that was as big as a world was enormous. Ha, it is rare that something thinks me weaker than another. The god laughed loudly, obviously reacting to Mash's thoughts. He should have expected something like that, but it was strange that his domain wasn't picking anything up. He knew that he couldn't feel the domain of another, and he guessed that the mind reading was an effect of his domain. If he couldn't lie, then he would just need to be honest. It was his usual plan anyway. I didn't mean it offensively, it's just hard not to compare those things. Mash tried to sound apologetic, but he knew that his voice wasn't all that serious. The god's domain was relaxing him, and he found himself growing more casual. He would need to figure out how it was affecting him and find a way to counter it. He didn't like the idea of being manipulated by someone just because they were a god. Well, let's get back to the important subject. First, let me go over how dungeons are actually made. There are two ways of which I know. The first is a natural phenomenon caused by two worlds with similar monodensities. For some reason, those spaces have a high chance to connect, though even I don't know why. As for the other method, it is through conquest and creation. My world, this world, is a subject of yours. The owner of your world had orchestrated an invasion many years ago, and we lost. Mash let that soak in, finally getting a grasp at the true nature of dungeons. His breath caught though, as the implications of the words hit him. He didn't like where this was going. Yes, we had lost our world, and now your world's owner is free to use it as he sees fit. To think, my grand world separated into dungeons meant to train a new generation of my old enemy. Fate is ever as cruel as I remember it. Mash noticed anger again, and this time it didn't vanish. Each word only made the emotion stronger, and it was practically solid within the domain. The muscles in his legs tensed, and he considered running away again. The god seemed to notice his tension, but he didn't let the anger drop this time. If anything, it seemed to get a little more intense. He understood why too, especially if what he said was true. Whoever owned his world had turned this one into little more than a game for his own. How many lives were ruined by doing something like this? How many dungeons were like this? Just thinking about that was enough to get him angry. It was such a waste of life. Wait, I'm not with my world's owner. If anything, I would say I'm against him, though I'm too weak to do anything about it. Mash tried to sound as convincing as he could, and he was relieved to feel the pressure fading. It seemed like the god believed him. Feeling like it was working, Mash started explaining more about his class and how the system was influencing his mind. How the world owner had been subtly controlling everyone, and how he wanted to stop that. It felt like he was making excuses to his family, and slowly tapered off. That's enough, I get your point. I wouldn't blame you either, it would be like blaming an insect for the actions of a god. No, I'm not going to do something like that. I don't have much more time here, so let me just ask, how serious are you about saving the people of this world? The god's question surprised Mash, but he managed to nod in response. The god could see into his mind, so it wasn't like speaking was all that necessary. The god seemed to understand and started speaking again. It sounded like he was rushing a bit, and Mash wondered what was going on. You can do something, although you will only be able to free a few. The reward your world's owner made for this dungeon is a combination of choice and results. Do well on the dungeon and I can help alter your rewards. Perhaps you will find the ability to free some of the people within the village. I'm sorry there isn't more I can do, too many things tying me up. Don't make the same mistake I did, don't become a god. Worst decision I made. As the god finished speaking, his body slowly dissipated into nothingness. This time Mash was able to observe a little of what was happening within his domain. When the god vanished, his whole body seemed to rejoin with the surroundings, and Mash realized that the god wasn't actually here. It was probably a type of magic. Even still, Mash muttered his gratitude. Thank you for everything. He spoke but was a bit too slow. Even as he spoke, he realized that the being was no longer. Sighing, he looked for the exit that God had mentioned and wanted to laugh at the comically plain wooden door. It was extremely unremarkable considering where he was. As if reacting to his thoughts, the wooden door turned to elaborate gold and became engraved with depictions of dragons. Okay, the god was definitely messing with him now. So, he was still connected to this place even if he couldn't manifest himself like before. Walking towards the door, Mash prepared to leave the trial. He had gained far more than he expected, even if there were no actual gifts. Getting the golden body was one thing, but the information felt far more valuable. Plus, he had even been given a chance to save some of the people in the village. Even if he couldn't save the whole world, he would do what he could. Maybe the others would be able to get the same reward, and they could save more than just a couple of people. Once he got outside, he was surprised to see that it was dark out. Feeling the cold drops of rain was relieving, and he enjoyed basking in the chilling rain. He wished he had taken something with him that could tell time, as he had no idea how much time had actually passed. If it was still the same day, then it would mean they spent the entire day in the trial. However, if a few days had already passed, then he wouldn't have any real idea of how long he had been in there. The others were presumably still taking the trial, at least that was what the god implied. Taking a seat, he looked towards the sanctuary, curious to see if he would see his friends appear. Slowly, he formed a wooden cover, deciding that he should probably block out the rain. The sanctuary felt slightly different now, and it felt like he could see a bit further too. He wanted to test his forms, but this wasn't a good location to go about breaking everything. The golden body had felt like it mixed with everything, and he bet that there would be some changes to his form's power too. He checked through his supplies and noticed that there were more potions, probably enough to get someone else to gold if needed. He could probably sell them back in his own world and wouldn't be surprised to receive a small fortune for them. As he watched the sanctuary, he was unsurprised to see Jill appear first. Honestly, with her skill set, he expected her to finish long before anyone else but imagined that time wasn't really consistent within the trial. She looked fine, though it seemed like she needed some more sleep. There were some bags under her eyes, and she walked over and took a seat beside him. Okay, so other than making you hot, what else did your gift do? Now Mash's curiosity was piqued, and he had to ask. What? No, I didn't receive a gift, but could I get a mirror? I got my golden body but haven't gotten a chance to see what that did to me. Jill pulled out a mirror from her storage space, and he decided that he would need to get one too. Honestly, his storage space was massive now, and he should probably fill it with all kinds of trinkets. His unusual attunement to the item had made it so that the storage space had been growing along with him, and it was easily big enough to hold a small house if he wanted to. The mirror was only about the size of his hand, but it would be good enough to see what she was talking about. Carefully, he examined himself and was surprised by the differences. There weren't any drastic changes, but he seemed to have an unnaturalness to his appearance. Much like how he remembered the auctioneers from before. Now that he was thinking about it, the twins were also pretty similar. His hair had grown and even had a slightly metallic sheen. He did have to admit that he looked better now, and even seemed a bit older. Well, that's enough of that. What gift did you get? He got bored of his appearance quickly and was much more curious to hear what Jill had received. Oh, finally done looking at yourself. Anyways, let me show you. As she finished speaking, something sprouted from her back. At first, he thought that they looked like butterfly wings, but in the end, they looked more like a fly. However, they glittered with light and stars, and it seemed oddly supernatural. A flight skill, while fun, seemed pretty useless for someone like Jill. She could just teleport and it would be much faster than any normal flight skill could be. She seemed happy with it though. You know that not everything you get has to make you stronger. Flying skills are just fun. Jill's annoyance was obvious, though Mash couldn't say anything in protest. He had been considering it purely in terms of power and realized that he did the same with every ability he got. Thinking about it, he never considered what abilities he could get that might just be fun to use. It was something he would need to consider. Almost any magic was available to him so long as he could find a monster that had it. Was there any reason not to grab everything he wanted to? Chapter 135, Gains and Goals. Mash and Jill only needed to wait a little longer for Red and Luke. Both appeared around the same time, and Luke was grinning like a madman. It was rare to see such an expression on him as he tended to be more reserved. On the other hand, Red also seemed pleased, but she also looked a little conflicted. So, you want to tell us what gifts you got? Mash got hot, and I got wings. Judging by your expressions, I'm guessing that you got something more interesting than that. Jill started speaking as soon as they got underneath the temporary roof and out of the rain. Still grinning like a fool, Luke spoke even before taking a seat. I got the ability to release some of the souls I have consumed. It was strange, like learning a technique I should have always had. That was not what Mash was expecting from his expression. Wouldn't something like that just make him weaker? Knowing Luke, he may have already released all of the souls he had taken. That was worrisome since it would mean that he was a lot weaker now. Did you get rid of the souls already? Won't you be weaker? Mash spoke hesitatingly, not wanting to put a damper on Luke's good mood. Luke slowly turned towards him, and he somehow managed to smirk and grin at the same time. No, I didn't get rid of them. Even if I do, I still get some of the benefits and gain a larger temporary boost when I do. If anything, I have become stronger. Luke sounded confident, but Mash still doubted him a little and almost spoke without thinking. He almost asked him if that meant that he would be more willing to steal souls now. Although, his better sense managed to stop the words, and he changed them at the last moment. Well then, Red, what did you get? It was the only thing he could think of to head off his poor comment and was glad to change the subject. Luke was sensitive around the subject of taking souls, and Mash almost put his own foot in his mouth. Yeah, what has you looking so confused? Jill spoke soon after Mash did. So fast that he thought that she was trying to stop him from doing something stupid. He tried giving her a look that said that he wasn't that much of a fool. The look he received in return told him that she thought otherwise. Red ignored the passing glares and spoke through them. I got this. As she was speaking, a red crystal emerged from her chest. It seemed to come from where her heart would be, and he wondered how that was possible. Then he remembered that her whole body and even her clothing were somehow made of blood. The gem was shaped like a cube. She started explaining what it was afterward. It's a blood ruby, and my trial was to bond with it. Didn't think it would end up as my reward too. The trial was surprisingly difficult, and I needed to. She trailed off as she saw the expressions on everyone's faces grow bored. Her eyebrows twitched slightly before she continued. You guys are insufferable. Fine, it lets me store mana for later use, and around 10,000 of it. The problem is that will take me a while to fill up. There, that's all you three care about anyways. All of you need to learn to appreciate the art of storytelling. It sounded like she was chastising children, though the three of them didn't care. The details of the trial might be interesting, but they really just wanted to hear about their powers. Talking about the trial could come later. After talking a little more, Mash shared his experiences and what the god had said. As he described his meeting with the god, the others actually had the gall to look bored at his encounter. Resisting the desire to roll his eyes, he just explained the details that the god had shared with him. They were more interested at the end of his recounting, and he didn't bother hiding his annoyance. In the end, he asked them the big question. Well, what do you think about giving up the reward to try and get the people out of the dungeon? Sounds good to me, but what is your plan afterward? I mean, we can't just bring thousands of people to our world without consequences, especially if some of them are as strong as the twins. Red was the voice of reason, but he had actually thought about this already. He had come up with an idea earlier and believed that it would work. Well, technically you and I are both nobles, so I was thinking of bringing them under our respective houses. Yours or mine would work, and I think my brother can help get them settled either way. She nodded her head in response to Mash's statement but was obviously giving the idea some thought. It took a second for her to come up with a response. You should bring them under your house. Arthur is a pretty good deterrent to stop people from making trouble, whereas my background would probably lead to more. She was right, and he should have thought about that. Currently, she was the only person in her new family, and it would be an enemy to her previous family. Mash could tell that her relationship with her family was bad, but he didn't know how far it would go. It should be fine though, his brother could manage a couple thousand people. At least, he knew that Arthur wouldn't be able to abandon them. Although, Mash knew that he would get chewed out for it later. Well, that's a plan for what to do at the end of the dungeon, but how do we plan on getting there? The god did say that we needed to do well. Luke sounded concerned, and way more reverent when he mentioned the god. Mash didn't think that was necessary, especially with how the god had acted. Plus, it seemed like the god had been a dragon. We do more of the same, look through the library for answers and be around to help deal with any problems that pop up. Occasionally go around with Edward to check for demons, and I think we will eventually get to the end. Listening to Jill, he was a bit surprised to hear how normal her plan was. He had been expecting her to come up with something more interesting. However, her idea was surprisingly tame considering how much she had been craving something exciting. Mash thought that Jill had become a thrill seeker of sorts and hadn't been able to find something exciting since getting her class advancement. None of them argued with her as it was the most sensible plan. They didn't really have any more leads yet and had gotten the power that they wanted. Now, all they needed to do was clear the dungeon. With a plan in mind, they took a few minutes to just relax before heading back to the village. By the way, I didn't actually get a gift. Apparently, I'm not considered human anymore. The new appearance is from the golden body. Now, they spent a little bit longer explaining each of their trials. He wondered how much time had passed since they entered the trial. Each of them had experienced a different passage of time. Jill's try had only taken her an hour or so. On the other hand, Luke's had lasted almost 3 days. Hearing about the strange way time had worked, they realized that they had no idea how many days had passed for the village. That thought got them to start moving. Jill teleported them next to the mansion, and Mash was glad to see that nothing looked changed. The village seemed fine, and he didn't see any signs of battle or destruction. Teleportation was such a convenient ability. Another thing Mash could do was reveal one of his transformations. He could act like that was one of the gifts he received and considered what he was willing to reveal. He would continue to hide his dragon form and use the power to surprise his enemies. The Priscilla form would be a good choice as it was similar to his dragon form but less powerful. It would help with his eventual sneak attack. It was still a bit evil looking though. After a little more consideration, he decided he would reveal the cat form if necessary. It should be good enough considering what it was capable of. They entered the mansion and were inducted into a commotion of sorts. Apparently, they had been gone for over a full day. Considering that would be 2 weeks back home, he realized that he had really wasted a lot of time. Even now, he would probably be spending some more time in here. The first thing they did when they got inside, was go and speak with Robert and Edward. The two of them updated them on what they had discovered, and he was surprised to hear that they had found a few more demons. There were a couple of servants with gifts related to sight, and 2 of them had been able to tell if someone was human or not. They had gone to almost every house with the 2 of them and found 2 more homes like the one they had visited. The current issue was that they weren't able to find out where the demons were coming from. The church had been rooted, so none should be coming from there. Furthermore, they had checked almost every house. Despite all of this, they found another family killed today. Edward's current plan required him to check the entire village every day, and it was obvious that that would exhaust him soon. They needed to find the source of the monsters or their target. If the target was an object, they could simply dispose of it and hopefully stop the demons that way. Knowing the source would be just as important, as it was something they would need to deal with. Mash had to wonder if it was a human doing this. The Lord believed it was one of his enemies, though he hadn't expanded on that matter. He only explained that his daughter was a target for many devoutly religious people, and he had a plethora of enemies. Trying to figure out who was the culprit would be pointless. Mash couldn't trust the man as it felt like he was being vague to cover up some greater truth. He didn't think that the man was the culprit behind the demons, but there was still something off about him. His suspicions really started when he saw how relaxed the man seemed about the whole situation. The Lord was strong enough that he should have been able to deal with the demons before they became a problem. Mash had to wonder why the man hadn't, and most of his research would be around the family's history. Their group spent several days of relative peace, checking the library daily for new information. They had focused on completing the dungeon but had also given themselves enough time to look at some other things. Red had listed dozens of items that existed in this world that would be valuable back home. When he asked her about it, she said that she was trying to find things these people could do once they were freed. He was somewhat jealous of her foresight but also knew that he was the kind of person to live in the moment. As he was reading up on the family history, he was surprised when he found something of importance. After reading the book for so long, he had begun doubting whether there was any valuable information in the library. Thankfully, something finally turned up, though he wasn't happy about what he read. Chapter 136, Linwood. The Linwood family dates back decades, even before the rise of the kingdom they swear fealty to. They had been a family centered around war and were a powerful military force for the kingdom. Despite the kindness they show to allies, there was a vindictive and cruel streak for their enemies. After the kingdom's expansion, there was not much left for the Linwood family, and they had begun losing their position in the noble courts. The family slowly fell from grace, and with it came a slew of problems. They struggled to find a place through politicking and wound up losing much of the privilege they had. The problems only grew worse, and eventually, the family was exploited for their talents. Several cases where the women and children of the family were kidnapped or manipulated. Apparently, people believed that those who had received powerful gifts were likely to have children who could accomplish the same. However, the family had a limit for what they were willing to take and eventually turned to more drastic measures. One of those was whole-scale violence against the other families. The family felt the need to remind others of their talents and started attacking other noble houses. At first, it started as a small physical altercation, that usually ended with a few dead, but the house was still intact. That semblance of peace only lasted for a short while, and the situation quickly escalated to more severe actions. The Linwood family began burning noble houses to the ground, doing to the families what they had wanted to do to them. Ultimately, even the king decided to intervene, trying to soothe the family's anger. It didn't work and the family started to oppose the king. They demanded to know where the retribution was when their family had been the victim. Their argument didn't go over well with the king, and the hammer of punishment came down on the family. It didn't immediately escalate to banishment and started with more mundane things. An increase in taxes and being forced to make some public apologies. The family was unsatisfied, and continued their actions, regaining some of their cruelness from their past. It grew to the point where the kingdom's whole noble society grew destabilized. Even this was not what drew the final line though. That came when the king tried to send them to battle once again. There was no need for war, and it had been to try and direct their strengths. However, the demand came as an obvious ploy to appease the other noble houses. There were several meetings between the head of the house, the current lord's father, and the king. The exact details of the interactions were left out, but the story had mentioned how their relationship only worsened. At some point, a line was crossed and the head of the house at the time was executed. The man's son was banished to an outer village to watch the borders. It was a final action, and the book worded it like the king was afraid of the family. He had exiled them for his own peace of mind. As Mash finished the story, he considered what it could mean. The Linwood family had been greatly wronged by the king. The current Mr. Linwood seemed content with his life, but that didn't fit with the image the story painted of their family. It did seem like the man was telling the truth when he mentioned having countless enemies. Their family had seriously targeted almost every noble family, the royal family included. Trying to figure out who was responsible would be near impossible. The others were looking for documentation on where demons were located. This world had monsters of some kind, and while these demons had not been seen before, Mash knew that they existed in this world. Red had read through dozens of books that detailed monsters and found several creatures that would match with the demons that they had fought before. Currently, she was trying to find their location on a map. They wanted to know who would even have had an opportunity to work with the creatures. They had discovered the obvious motivation of the supposed assassins but still needed to find out who was in the position to get support from creatures like demons. The map revealed a lot of the world. When the king said outer village, he really meant outer. This village was actually beyond the borders of the kingdom and rested in a mostly neutral place between two kingdoms. Furthermore, it was tucked away between two large rivers. The king had obviously been trying to isolate the Linwoods and had driven them into both a literal and figurative corner. I found it. The demons should be next to some place called the Artok Mountains. According to the book, it's a pretty isolated place. Luke sounded confident, and he laid the book on the table for them to see. It was easy to find the location on the map, though it didn't really answer any questions. The mountain range was actually a part of the territory that was sectioned off by two rivers and was dangerously close to the village. It was close enough that he believed that the Linwoods should have been able to notice. How did someone gain access to the demons while avoiding the notice of someone like the Lord? Or Edward? I heard he has clones constantly scouting the surroundings. Jill's questions did make him reconsider the situation. She was right. The distance was so close that anyone should have been able to observe the demons coming to the village. New demons had been appearing, and they still hadn't been able to find the source. Edward and Robert were checking the village constantly, trying to find any entrance for the demons. Their search had been entirely futile, and even the Lord himself started to take part in the search. Even still, there had been no new discoveries. Thinking about it, Mash began to consider something more nefarious in the works. The layout of the map made him think that no one outside of the village would even be able to interact with demons. He knew that there was a chance that the demons were working independently, but that felt wrong considering the nature of the dungeon. Plus, he imagined they would have just invaded with force rather than all of the subterfuge needed for sneaking into the village. The book Luke found indicated that the demons weren't particularly conniving and tended to have a culture defined by survival of the fittest. All of these things made him think that someone else had to be involved. They had spent all their time looking for culprits outside the village, but that was wrong. The demons in the village were too isolated for something like that. It wasn't impossible, but someone like Edward would have been able to notice someone coming in and out of the territory. Changing their focus towards the village itself, their list of culprits grew a lot smaller. The Linwoods were well liked in the village and had only had problems with a handful of people. It wouldn't take long to check them, but something about that list felt wrong. None of the people involved were particularly capable and shouldn't have been able to orchestrate something like this. No, Mash's initial instinct was that it needed to be someone more capable. The temple was a suspect, but he imagined the dungeon would have ended once Luke massacred everyone in there. They had checked to see if anyone from the temple was missing that day and had confirmed that everyone had been present. Luke still wouldn't talk about the exact details of what had happened but insisted that there wasn't much to gain. The church had been working with the demons, but most of the members were crazy and beyond reason. There were a lot of things in this village that didn't make a lot of sense. The church here didn't have any capable healers, and the members were all corrupt. How and why did the temple even appear in the village? Only a member of the Linwood family would be able to do something like that. Maybe one of the servants could have had the opportunity for it as well, but they would need to be skilled at imitation or something along those lines. The head butler? An assistant? Mash considered who could have been in the position to handle something like that. After discussing their thoughts, the group formulated a few options. They could try and dig up more information on the Linwood family and their servants, or check the villagers for someone who hated their lord. Lastly, they could visit the demon territory, as it wasn't all that far from here. They didn't really want to split up this time and decided that they would check the demon territory first. Their group was very capable of things like scouting, and it sounded like the safest option that would give them actual results. The villagers were likely to be a dead end, and accusing the Linwoods sounded like a fast way to make powerful enemies. With everything in mind, they decided to investigate the demons directly. They did a little bit of final preparation and prepared to head out. Along the way, they ran into Robert. He looked at them and their gazes and seemed to process the situation. "Where are you all headed? And do you want some muscle?" He smiled and flexed jokingly as he finished his questions. Mash tried to think of a response, as they didn't want to let him know the actual plan. Although, Red spoke before anyone else could and waved her hand in dismissal as she did so. "No, we are going out for a much more mundane purpose today. The trial was exhausting and sitting in the library all day is getting monotonous. We are merely looking to take a break for a day or two." They requested that I continue to help them for the break and figured I could use one myself. There was a flash of concern across the man's eyes, but he just gave them a smile. His appearance was still slightly off, and it was clear that he was still bothered by some things. The concern was probably genuine, though Mash found himself doubting it. He hoped that Robert was genuine, as he was a very likable man, but Mash was more careful now. Leah had made him understand the price of trusting too easily. Robert's response was clear, and his voice sounded normal too. "That sounds fun. Well, I won't stop you. Things have been slowing down anyways, and we have caught most of the demons." They talked a little more but quickly said their goodbyes and separated. They didn't run into anyone else and managed to get out of the house easily. Once outside, Mash saw Jill clap Red on the back in acknowledgement. It seemed like liars appreciated a good lie when they saw them. Mash only made a mental note to pay more attention when they were talking to him. Slowly he shuffled closer to Luke, though he gave him an expression that said, "I am at least better than you." Mash gave him a slightly offended expression, and they headed towards the demon's homeland. Chapter 137, Flying High. To get there they had to pass through several forests. There weren't any monsters in them. Trying to be sneaky was the plan, but Mash couldn't use the form that let him go invisible. The others wouldn't be able to keep up with his invisibility, and there was always the chance that one of the demons had the ability to detect him. Then he remembered Jill's sight might let her teleport to him if anything went wrong. "Jill, can you follow my locations with the skills you have?" They were still a good distance away from the demons, so he didn't mind discussing their skills at the moment. He was a bit confused when she shook her head in the negative. She must have noticed he didn't understand, as she gave him an explanation. "Aren't you the one with a mark from a being stronger than gods that is literally designed to stop skills from seeing your fate?" She was right, though the snarky tone was unnecessary. Honestly, he had somewhat forgotten about the things the marks did and had assumed that it would only stop the snake from seeing him. He should see what skills fail because of the marks and should probably study them more in general. It was something he had been ignoring since it felt so far beyond him. Although, he would need to do that later. Understanding could only come through effort. "Remind me to check the marks after my next advancement," he told Priscilla to remind him, as her memory was literally perfect. Ultimately, he wanted to get rid of both marks regardless of what benefits they provided. It was simply another thing that was forced on him by circumstance, and he wanted to make sure to prevent any influence those might have on his life. That was something to solve in the future though. They continued to walk for a bit, eventually noticing the difference in their surroundings. The first thing that changed was the trees. They started looking more decayed, and some of the leaves had turned white. It was strange to feel like the trees had grown old, but that was it looked like. It was as if they aged as people would. Eventually, the grass began to change, as it too started turning white. At this point, they decided that flying would be better. All of them could fly now, even Red could do it by manipulating her body. She could just control her whole body to rise into the air and move it with her magic. When she had first tried that, it looked wrong, like her body was being lifted up by invisible ropes. Now, it seemed somewhat normal, though it still felt weird to see her move without actually needing to make any physical movements. Luke had his item and could fly just as well as any of them. Finally, Mash had the opportunity to use one of his transformations, and he couldn't help but feel a bit giddy at the prospect. When he achieved his golden body, he felt that it affected everything about him, including his transformations. He really wanted to use his dragon form, but that wasn't really the best thing for a stealth operation. It would get its time to shine, of that, he had no doubt. As he changed into the cat form, he was surprised to notice the differences immediately. His face didn't grow any fur on it, and his hair grew out more like into something like a mane, framing his head as fur would. His whole body was covered in white fur that matched his hair too, and he noticed the change to his wings. Before they looked more unnatural, but now it reminded him perfectly of some birds. They were smaller now, but he felt like he could make them larger with a thought. His hands and feet had become less human too, growing into something that resembled a cat, and he could feel claws on his fingers. He even felt a tail trapped within his clothing and had to pull it out with his hands. Finally, he noticed the changes in abilities. His mental affinity had improved so drastically, that he could actually feel the emotions of the others just by looking at them. Furthermore, his reflexes and sixth sense had improved greatly. He was much more aware of his surroundings too, even his domain felt more natural. His friends noticed the differences too, as before his fur was a different color from his hair. Plus, his face had also grown fur before. Looking at his friends now, he could feel their apprehension. He wondered if all people with mental magic had to deal with this. Well, what happened? Mash couldn't help but sound a bit hesitant, unsure of what exactly they were noticing that he was not. As he talked, he noticed that his tongue was longer, and collided with sharp teeth. Feeling around his mouth, he noticed that 4 of his teeth were longer and sharper than the others. He wondered how this form would affect the insides of his body but didn't have a method to check. Priscilla would probably warn him if something bad had happened. Luke spoke up first, seeming the fastest to adjust. Your soul changed shape with your transformation, it didn't do that before. Plus, you don't look human anymore, and it's kind of weird to see an animal standing on 2 legs. Jill continued as soon as Luke stopped, and Mash looked down at his hands and feet. It was true to an extent. His limbs would certainly be more natural on an animal, and his way of using them looked wrong, even to himself. Should he try emulating an animal more? He discarded that thought, imagining himself moving on all 4s. However, he wasn't planning on walking on all 4s. I'm not going to crawl if that is what you're thinking. His voice was also slightly different, and he noticed he was slurring some of his words. It was definitely strange, but he couldn't do anything about it. It was simply how this form worked. This is fascinating and all, but can we just get on with it? Red sounded bored and a little like she was expecting something like this. She thrust her hands toward the demon territory, and the 4 of them took to the air. Mash wings grew a little when he did so, but they were still smaller than they were before, only reaching just beyond his arm's length. The feathers were harder, and somehow more shaped than they were before. They flew just over the treetops, careful to stay hidden from any possible watchtowers. He couldn't see any structures but knew that they were heading in the right direction. Better to be careful. They hadn't seen any but didn't want to take the risk. Plus, this distance would let them drop into the trees if they needed cover. Honestly, Mash camouflaged pretty well with the trees, as his fur was all white and he had worn a white shirt too. That was a lucky coincidence. They flew for a few minutes before the demons' camps came into sight. They were spread out over a large area and were probably around twice the size of the village. They weren't very advanced though, and he noticed most of the structures were no better than huts. There weren't any real walls either. There were a lot of demons though. Most were these small hideous creatures with odd potbellies. They looked both starved and fat at the same time, and Mash was disturbed by the sight. There were crude fires and pieces of meat being cooked, and that alone had surprised him. He had assumed that the monsters would eat raw meat, so seeing them cook felt wrong. There was another problem with what he saw. The larger demons that had invaded the town were further in the back and it seemed like the strongest demons here were the white-skinned ones he fought before. Those were around level 60 but weren't actually a threat to any of them. On top of them being higher level, their classes were unique and stronger than most at the same level. Honestly, Mash was fairly certain that he alone could destroy this whole place and kill all the demons. Which meant that Robert, Edward, or Mr. Linwood would all be able to do the same. The question in his mind was why they hadn't. What do you guys think? He sent the words through the telepathy, the new form letting him send it to all of them at once. His improved mental magic was incredible, and he told Priscilla to remember the method that he was using now. Hopefully, he would be able to send messages like this even without the form. They would have to speak to answer him, but he still wanted to be as silent as possible. They seemed equally as interested and merely shrugged their shoulders for a response. "Jill, do you see anything?" She nodded vigorously, making some odd gestures with her hands. After a second, he understood what she was doing. She was mimicking weaving, probably to indicate her strings. Mash sent a mental message to confirm anyways. Strings leading towards the village. Nodding once again, she held up 4 fingers. It seemed like they had some leads, but there was still the question of what to do with demons. Remembering what they had done to the people back at the village, he was tempted to destroy them all. Fly around and try to find more permanent structures. Even the demons should have managed to make something. These do not seem capable enough to detect you if you do so. Priscilla sent the message, followed by an image of several birds she had spotted while looking over the demon territory. It was a good idea, and he was about to tell the others as much. However, they were already nodding. Priscilla had sent the information to all of them, and he realized that she was probably being affected by his improved affinities too. Now, he wanted to test his Priscilla form and see what it would do to his lightning magic. He could feel her eagerness at the idea too. They took the air once again, feeling a cold wind cross them as they headed deeper into the demon lands. The demons had really taken a large chunk of land, but they still hadn't seen any permanent structures or any demons above the white-skinned ones. It took a while, but they eventually noticed something more complex. At first, they had been looking for a fort of some kind, but it was Jill who noticed that something deeper. It was probably due to her strings, but she pointed out a tunnel. Even from a distance, they could see demons moving in and out of the tunnel and guessed that there was a more permanent structure within. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for. Mash was tempted to just fly in there but knew that was not smart. If they decided to do something like that, Jill would be the one to go. Unless they had a way to lock down her teleports, she could teleport away at the earliest sign of danger. They flew a bit higher, before discussing their next course of action. The conversation didn't last long, and they ultimately decided to let Jill enter on her own. She would try and sneak in and would hopefully return with some new information. She didn't actually fly down but teleport directly to the ground. When she did that, Mash realized what the real strength of a flight skill was for her. Teleporting freely within sight and being able to fly meant that her teleportation space had expanded to the skies as well. Mash watched as she teleported from place to place, flinching every time she got close to a demon. Logically, he knew that she would be fine, but couldn't help but worry a little. He kept flinching until she vanished into the tunnels. 138, demons again. The wait was probably the most agonizing thing about the situation, and Mash realized how the others must have felt when he did something like this. The other two didn't seem anywhere near as worried as he was, though he understood why. Jill would be able to escape from literally anyone. He had no doubts about that fact, but this was a much more selfish concern. It was created purely because he was unable to do anything but wait. He realized that he had been obsessing over getting involved in every situation, and would need to learn that he couldn't do everything himself. Eventually, he saw the start of a commotion, but a moment later Jill was beside him. She didn't look the least bit bothered. However, she had her javelin drawn, and he noticed the end was covered in blackish blood. She had no other injuries, and there was not a single drop of blood on anything other than the weapon. She had apparently decided that it had been time to start fighting. Hopefully, that meant she found what she wanted rather than just got impatient. There were 5 of the blackish demons, now there are only 4. Other than that, only whites. Mash looked at her and noticed the oddly bored expression on her face. Her eyes had gone flat like she didn't care about the commotion she had started. Honestly, he bet that she had done it intentionally. He wanted to laugh at his earlier concern. It actually sounded like she was planning on defeating all the demons herself and had only told them because they wanted to know. Red did not seem as amused. "You are being too reckless, but either way, did you see anything?" Jill rolled her eyes at the comment, but responded, nonetheless. It didn't seem like Red's words would get through to her, and he didn't really have anything to say either. The only time Jill would need to be concerned was when something had the ability to stop her teleportation. That wouldn't happen at dungeons of this level. A skill or ability like that would almost be impossible to run into. Yeah, there were a few threads that led back into the village. "We can head back too if you guys want." It was certainly an option, but her sarcastic tone made it obvious that she wasn't actually planning on just leaving. Luke and Red obviously wanted to fight as well. Mash wasn't any different, his anger having risen over the past few days. The peacefulness of the past week had given him ample time to consider the actions of the demons. Although, he hadn't been given an opportunity to vent that anger. It had been ruminating, patiently waiting for an outlet. Finally, he had the opportunity. No, let's fight, do as much damage as we can. Let me attack first, I want to test my dragon form. Mash was eager to use his new power, and this would be just as good of an opportunity. So long as there were no purple demons, he was confident that their group could handle the monsters. The confidence bled into his voice. Red nodded but had a demand for herself. Fine, but let me fight the black demons. Everyone agreed, knowing that it was something that she felt like she needed to do. Despite Red's demand, Mash still sent Jill a mental message. You should go with her, just in case. She didn't give any signs of confirmation, but he knew that she received the message. He believed that she would do it, although he expected that Red would be fine. Her class made her really good at not dying, and he was curious to see how strong she had become. Mash let the thoughts fall to the back of his mind as he looked over the entirety of the demon territory. It was bigger than the village, though not by much, and he believed that he could do a lot of damage in a single attack. Priscilla understood as he saw outlines beginning already. It wasn't for an attack he had seen before and realized it was because of the wide area he wanted to affect. Most of the demons were so far beneath him that he was unlikely to need a lot of power. They probably wouldn't give him any levels either, however, he had no sympathy for the callous creatures. He changed to the dragon form, prepared to grow out wooden wings. It proved unnecessary as this form seemed to have gained wings of its own. There were a lot of differences to this transformation as well. He had bulked up physically, his muscles thickening noticeably. His scales had grown even thicker and covered his body like metal plates. Their color had somehow become a deeper shade of black. He could feel as though some of his bones shifted too, allowing for a thicker tail to sprout from his back. His tail was half as tall as he was, and his wings were enormous. There was no shrinking them, so he would need to get used to fighting with them. Each wing was as long as he was tall, though they didn't feel like weak points. If anything, they felt like a shield that he could use to protect himself. It had always bothered him that such powerful creatures would have something as frail as wings, but having them he could tell that they were sturdier than the strongest shields. The scales on his wings seemed stronger than the ones coating his body. There were sharp spikes along the sides of his wings, making them vicious weapons as well. It turned out that a dragon's wings were one of their strongest features. His hands and feet had changed, becoming bigger and sharper. Claws extended from each of his fingers. It felt like his fingers had grown connected, and he realized that he was left with only 3 on each hand. He thrummed with power, it felt like it was straining his body. It wanted to be released, but he contained it until Priscilla finished her outline. He saw his friends move away from him slightly. They knew who he was but were coping with what. For now, Mash ignored them, focusing entirely on what was to come. Once the outline was finished, he didn't hesitate on flooding it with his newfound power. He didn't care for energy costs as his hunt skill would trigger for a fight like this. This was a fight to the death, and he was certain there would be a lot of it. These creatures deserved it in his mind. Lightning swelled in his body, flowing into his wings until he felt them vibrating from the magic. He could see some of the lightning bleeding out and bouncing with his scales. It rolled across him, making him look like an avatar of lightning. The energy began pooling around the pointed ends of his wings and built up until it could no longer be contained. He had already felt his hunt skill trigger, the added power being incorporated into the attack. Then the power was released, and lightning rained down over all of the demon's territory. Large bolts spread from the points of his wings and struck down upon the scattered camps. There was no accuracy involved in his strikes. The bolts struck the ground and expanded, hitting anything they could. Each was stronger than Priscilla's attack had been when he had first met her. Each killed a countless number of demons, and the rain of bolts didn't end anytime soon. Continuing to rain down like strikes from a god. The sound of thunder drowning out all other noise. He vaguely noticed demons running to their underground shelter but ignored them as lighting continued to cascade over the rest of the land. Their simple huts and camps were destroyed, the very ground scorched black from the bolts. The world was colored by his lightning, its light was more intense than the sun itself. His attacks struck down like the hand of God, crashing into the ground violently. This much power was only a fraction of what a real dragon could produce. He couldn't shake the image of the one dragon he had seen and remembered how large it was. A single attack from something like that would be able to destroy part of the world. The thought came to his mind and reminded him of how reckless he had been at the time. A single mistake could have led to countless people dying. The attack continued for only a couple of seconds, but the effects were unlikely to vanish anytime soon. The destruction felt strangely good, and he stopped the attack himself. He could have kept going until every demon was dead until there was no hope for them to retaliate, but he stopped when he started enjoying the destruction. It was not something he wanted to take pleasure in. This attack was him letting out the emotions he had been forced to contain over the past few days. Even if he didn't enjoy the combat, he wouldn't feel any empathy towards the demons. They were truly evil. Trying to understand the emotion, he realized that he wasn't enjoying the destruction but the power. It was filling him with pride, though he didn't understand why he was feeling it. A concern for another time, instead his gaze flowed down to what his attack had done. The camps had almost all been turned to rubble, and the ground was crisscrossed with black marks. He had even managed to gain a level and knew that that would only happen from killing hundreds of lesser demons, maybe even thousands. Once he stopped his attack, his friends teleported away, presumably to fight the demons underground. Mash flew down, heading to clean up what remained. He would follow the others once he made sure that the white demons on the outside were dealt with. Those were around level 60 and could prove troublesome to the villagers. The lesser demons were dangerous but didn't really have the damage output to prove a significant issue. Mash flew low to the ground, sending blasts of lightning at any demon he saw. Being so close to the ground, he realized just how much destruction he had caused. The smell of burnt flesh and grass filled his nostrils. The demon's rancid skin smelled worse when burned and the stench hung in the air like a cloud. This attack was on the same level as the purple demon's flame had been. In fact, he had taken more lives than that monster had. His had spread over a much wider range and had been just as indiscriminate. Plus, his lightning was extremely quick and none of the demons could dodge it. The combination of the power from this world and his unique class was immense. In terms of raw power, he would be unparalleled for his level. This only proved to him that seeking out more power outside of the class system could only lead to benefits. Plus, he still had the quest to upgrade his body again. That would be something he would need to figure out. He had become significantly stronger after getting the golden body, even more than his status alone would suggest. The white demons he encountered didn't last any longer than the lesser demons. A single strike enough to kill any of them. It was startling to realize just how much of a difference his golden body had made. He didn't need to rely on his imitations to do significant damage anymore but felt a temptation to try it anyways. There was no reason to test that now though, and he held off on satisfying his curiosity here. The combination of his skills seemed to exponentially increase his power. For now, he needed to return to his friends. Once he scoured the territory, he returned to the entrance of their underground fort. The sounds of fighting and screaming echoed from within, and he entered quickly. His wings were actually a detriment here, as they took up much of the space inside. He would need to figure out how to move properly with them, especially inside of buildings. Chapter 139, Demonic People. The inside of the tunnel was lined with stone structures. Not home, but large communal housing structures. There had been a lot of demons inside. Now as he walked through, it felt eerily quiet. The others had made quick work of the creatures inside, though he guessed he had wasted some time reining in his emotions. The transformations were affecting him quite a lot, and he needed to get used to how they affected his mentality. He made sure to take advantage of his draconic domain, using it to peek into the buildings as he passed. There were indeed dead demons inside, and he didn't sense anything inside. A few of the bodies looked serene, as though they never even got hurt. He wondered how those demons had died and would ask the others later. Luke may have stolen their souls, but it looked more like they had just died without even knowing what was happening. He heard fighting further into the tunnel and followed the curving downward path. There were a few lights along the walls that shone with oddly white fire. Their attacks were all of the black flames, and he wondered how these torches burned white. He considered eating the demon corpses he passed but decided against it. After achieving a golden body, his transformations have been affecting his mentality a little bit. It didn't feel like his thoughts or decision were due to someone else, but it did feel like some of his emotions were exaggerated when he was transformed. He didn't want to test his demon forms, unsure of how they could affect him. However, he was curious to test his Priscilla form. It would give him some insights into how she thought, and what feelings she based her actions on. It would hopefully alleviate some of the concerns regarding her influence. He wouldn't change his form now though, as he was finally getting used to the new feeling of pride. The caverns were surprisingly dry, and he noticed what looked like sand occasionally falling from above. The battle ahead was enough to cause the caverns to shake slightly. He picked up his pace, running through the caverns now. With his pace, he would be able to reach his friends quickly. With Jill there, he wasn't that worried but still wanted to see how the fights were going. As he arrived, he saw Red fighting against 2 of the black demons. The other 2 were already dead, and there were plenty of demon corpses lining the room. More seemed to be coming in through other entrances, but Jill and Luke were handling them easily. Luke was moving a lot faster than he had been before. He had probably used the new technique he had gotten from the trial. It was a bit of a waste, but it was also important to get familiar with the skill. It didn't look like anyone needed help, but he still made his way over to Luke to help him out. Jill was obviously keeping an eye on Red, and he didn't want to add another distraction. He also took glances at Red's fight. The lesser demons wouldn't even be able to damage him through his scales, and he could easily kill them without putting in any effort. Plus, Red's fight was much more interesting. Her new skills and abilities were extremely unique. Her body was constantly changing into the blood and weaving around or ignoring attacks in their entirety. Even things like the black flames and their other magic were easily avoided or blocked. They honestly seemed slower than normal too, and he wondered what was happening. One of the demons dropped to the ground, clutching their stomach, and thrashing violently with their other hand. After a few seconds, it stopped moving, and Mash saw some blood pouring from its mouth. It drifted towards Red, and the black blood changed to match her own as it was absorbed. There was only one demon remaining, and Red walked towards it slowly. She didn't have her guard up or anything, and the demon took advantage of that, stabbing at her heart with its long nails. They punched through Red's body easily, but she didn't even flinch from the attack. She simply retaliated, turning one of her hands into a spear, and copying the demon's motion. Her attack didn't have the power to punch through the demon like it had done to her, but it was still strong enough to bypass the creature's flesh and strike whatever organs lay beneath. Mash didn't actually know where the vital organs of a demon were. The demon died from the attack anyways, but Red still looked tense. She ended up joining in killing the remaining demons. It didn't take long to finish off whatever creatures remained. They didn't go out of their way to chase any of those who had fled, as the remaining demons wouldn't be able to do much. The dungeon still hadn't ended though, which meant that there was still something for them to deal with. Once the fighting ended, Mash felt the buff's end, and his body run out of energy, but he didn't fall unconscious. Considering how much energy he used, he was surprised when he remained conscious. He couldn't move in the slightest, but he was glad to be aware. Hopefully, that would be a change that stuck around. That alone would make the golden body worthwhile in his mind. Since he was able to maintain his consciousness, he could use his inhuman hibernation skill to restore himself and leave Luke to go through his own recovery. They ended up waiting there for half an hour, but Mash recovered his energy and was ready to return to the village. Jill said that she saw a few strings now, but also mentioned that something seemed wrong with them. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but it was enough to get them to rush. They could come back and investigate the grounds further later, and possibly even grab Edward to help. They went fast, significantly faster than they had gone before. Jill actually went ahead by teleporting herself back to town. She couldn't take all 4 of them that distance but could manage herself. The rest of them would take a few minutes to arrive. While that wasn't a long time, Mash was still a little worried about sending her ahead. Honestly, he would need to get used to Jill taking the lead, as she was by far the most defensive of the group. In the past, it would be his duty, and it felt a bit weird needing to give it up. Although, he finally understood what it must have felt like for the others back when he had been separated from them. Arriving at the village, Mash was glad to see that nothing looked particularly wrong. He had revealed the cat form already and didn't mind using it now. It wouldn't matter if someone saw him, as he had supposedly passed his recent trial. They had planned to meet Jill outside of the mansion, so they flew directly there. Mash easily saw as she stood behind the building. Landing beside her, the grass ruffled as he touched the ground. Luke and Red arrived too, but their flights didn't make as much of a disturbance. Both of their methods came from methods that didn't actually manipulate the wind. Jill began telling them the situation as soon as they landed. The threads are definitely leading into the mansion, but they dissolve when they get close. That explains why I couldn't see them when looking at the place itself. She sounded frustrated as if she expected her skill to just tell her everything that she wanted. It was a bit strange, but Mash thought that she was acting more childish as of late. He knew a little bit about fairies and the like and knew that they were supposed to be mischievous and selfish creatures. Was Jill's recent advancement causing her to mimic some aspects of those creatures? That could be a problem, but they had something a bit more urgent to deal with. I think that the Lord himself is behind everything. Red shocked everyone by speaking, and she sounded confident in the accusation too. Everyone turned to look at her, and Mash shared some of his own thoughts. I thought about that too but couldn't figure out why he would poison his own daughter. If he could control the demons, I thought that he would use them for revenge. Although nothing I thought of explaining why his daughter wound up getting poisoned. His voice showed his uncertainty, but Red only nodded her head in agreement. It seemed like she had an idea of what was going on. I think it was to get his children involved in his vengeance. Neither Edward nor Robert seemed to care at all about their family's past, but if that led to someone targeting their sister then. We have all seen how quick Edward is to anger. My guess is that their father planned on getting someone from the church to heal her and reveal that the poison was from the kingdom proper. I think he was preparing for a war and wanted to get his sons to join him before revealing the demons. Mash didn't know if what Red was saying was accurate, but it sounded good enough to at least confront the man. The real question was how to go about this. They could probably get Edward's and Robert's aid, if they learned of the situation. The real question was figuring out how to do that without offending them. Edward in particular might attack them for accusing his father of something like poisoning his own daughter. Avoiding a fight with all three of them was what they wanted to do, especially if Edward and Robert were truly innocent. So, how do you want to handle this? They all looked toward Red, obviously noting that she was the most aware of the situation. They all had access to the same information, but she had been the first to determine a culprit. Mash still felt like Edward made a bit more sense considering that he was the one that scouted the nearby forests. Although Red's proposed idea seemed to account for that possibility. I think we just bring up the matter in front of the three of them at once. If things are looking like they are all hostile, Jill can teleport us out. Although to be completely honest, I think we could take them. She sounded extremely confident, and he didn't disagree. While the twins and the Lord were stronger physically than them, he didn't think they could hold a candle to his dragon form. Jill was unlikely to get hit, and if needed Luke could probably beat them by taking their souls. Honestly, it might be a good idea to do that anyway. Whoever the culprit ended up being, their power would be extremely useful. If they went to other dungeons Luke could gain a lot by stealing some of their souls, but Mash doubted that he could convince him to do something like that. It still seemed like he would only take the souls of things he thought were truly atrocious. Despite expecting a rejection, he still brought up the topic. Luke reversed the situation asking Mash why he wouldn't eat the person's corpse. Mash would be able to gain the abilities just like Luke could. Mash didn't have a good response to that and could only nod his head. However, that question did linger in his mind. Eating humans was obviously bad, but what could he gain by doing so? He realized that he was genuinely giving the thought some consideration, and he shuddered. That was something he couldn't do. Trying to dismiss the question, he moved the discussion to their present situation. They talked a bit more and ironed out the remaining details of the plan. Chapter 140, Allies and Enemies. Mash was standing behind Red along with the other two. All of them were in a conference room of sorts, the three eldest members of the Linwood family sitting in front of them. The lord of the household was known as Albert Linwood, and he was an imposing man. Somehow, Mash had missed that earlier, but seeing him sit in what looked like a wooden throne, the man seemed much more the overbearing emperor. His clothes weren't anything fancy, but he felt more like a noble now. Or maybe Mash was just projecting because of his suspicions. Either way, he had Priscilla start preparing some magic. If things came down to it, he could probably stun them long enough for the rest of his group to respond. Thinking about it, he informed the others through a mental message. When things start going too bad, close your eyes. He couldn't get a response from them but knew that they would be quick enough to react with just that much forewarning. Red stood confidently, ready to present her case. She was going to use her position to her advantage, making it seem like she was truly angry and vengeful. It was something she had already revealed to them and would hopefully lead to the situation escalating quickly. She started by asking a very pointed question. Why did you poison Rebecca? The accusation in her tone was quite obvious, and Mash thought she did a good job of projecting her anger. She was really good at lying, and he wondered if her race change had anything to do with it. He didn't know much about intelligent undead, and nobody else would have any better information. Liches weren't really open to conversation, and intelligent undead tended to be too dangerous to learn things about. Making sure that people didn't find out about Red's race would be extremely important. Mash's eyes were focused on the Lord, and he noticed the slightest shift in the mana around the man. It wasn't an attack, but he was preparing for something. Mash matched the man's mana preparing his own attack but stopped when he heard Edward speak. "You dare accuse my father of poisoning his own daughter? Do you even?" Edward really was the angry type, and some veins bulged on his forehead, as he rose to his feet. Mash didn't feel any mana radiating off of him though and guessed that he wasn't planning on actually fighting. Robert just stared dumbly at his father. That seemed like a good sign, and Mash sent a message to the others. Robert looks confused and is somewhat suspicious of his father. He might know something. Mental communication was proving just as useful as he would have expected, and he conveyed the information to the others. He didn't know if they had noticed, but he wasn't missing any details with his draconic domain. Watching things like the movements of someone's face and mana was extremely easy. He had a good situation of what was happening, though it still felt like a toss-up between Edward and Albert. So, he prepared to fight both of them if needed. Red cut off Edward during his tirade, speaking words that seemed to freeze the man. "Do you really think I would be here if anything else was the case? We went to the demon lands and know that your father is working with them. How do you think they keep getting into the village? Why hasn't he dealt with it?" Her head turned towards Edward for part of her words, and Mash noticed the hesitation dashing across his face. Edward wouldn't trust them automatically, but Red had adopted the role of someone who cared deeply about his sister, and Mash himself had some credibility in the town. Furthermore, he had experienced firsthand the nastiness of the demons and would be more inclined to believe them. There was clearly a conflict in Edward's mind, but it had also become clear that Robert trusted them. Taking the risk, Mash sent him a message and made sure his friends received it too. "Robert, it's Mash, get ready to capture your father. Even if you don't trust us, just be ready." In Mash's mind, everyone he could get would be a valuable ally, and he hoped that Edward would join them. From the way things were going, he expected that Edward would join them but wasn't sure yet. Hearing Red's questions, he thought that she didn't see him as the culprit. Trusting her, he turned his attention and focus entirely on the Lord. It finally looked like he was ready to respond. "You lay all this accusation on me, without even the smallest bit proof. It sounds like you have little more than speculation." That reaction told Mash all he needed. Those words condemned the man. The only people that asked for and expected proof were those that were guilty. Also, it was only those who understood the laws that said things like that. This situation was outside the laws, and words like that didn't really provide any defense. They didn't actually need any proof. Mash noticed Edward's face turn towards his father, and the Lord seemed to notice his mistake. How had he done something so foolish? Shouldn't a man like that be more capable? He noticed Red smirk slightly and guessed that she had baited him somehow. He didn't know what she could have done, but the argument had quickly turned into an interrogation. Edward's questioning gaze added to their side, and Mash knew that the fight was coming. "Why Rebecca?" Robert's voice was a mix of sadness and anger, and Mash saw tears beginning to form in his eyes. Those two words ended up being the start of the fight, as Mash felt the Lord's mana swell. That was his cue, and he let out a blast of blinding lightning. It wasn't meant to hurt anyone but would sting anyone's eyes. The Lord's attack delayed slightly, and it was enough time for Robert to ram a fist in his father's side. There was a resounding explosion from the attack, and Mash wondered if the attack would kill the elderly man. The old man was sent crashing through the wall behind, straight out of the house and into the nearby hill. The flowers got crushed under some of the falling rock, but the Lord actually seemed unharmed. He didn't even land on his back, and it seemed like the punch had been little more than a shove. The old man held his hand forward, and Mash saw black lightning crackle across it. That actually made Mash relax, as lightning was something he could handle. Mash had already begun turning into his dragon form, knowing that the man would be stronger than the black demons. He was even more powerful than the twins, and holding back was an obvious mistake. Mash heard some steps coming from the rest of the building but ignored them as he jumped at the old man. The old man threw his lightning at him, and Mash brushed it aside with one of his wings. They were indeed a lot more durable now, but the lightning still managed to singe his soul. He was surprised that it had managed even that and would need to warn the others. First, he would push the old man back. Preparing to punch the man as Robert had earlier, Mash watched as the old man prepared to catch the blow. Mash was confident that the man couldn't handle his strength, but he didn't even need to contest with him directly. Jill appeared within his domain, and he could tell what she was doing easily. Letting her magic bypass his defenses, he appeared beside the old man. The Lord's eyebrows rose slightly, and he tried reacting, but he wasn't fast enough. In reality, he only had a golden body and wasn't as strong as Mash was physically, especially when he was in his dragon form. He certainly wasn't as fast, and Mash's fist slammed into the man's rib. There was a cracking sound, though the old man had actually managed to jump with the blow. Mash swung while turning his body and sent the man toward Red and Luke. Even if they weren't as strong as the man physically, they were close though and both had magic that ignored most defenses. The old man wasn't completely defenseless though, and his body was wrapped in black flames, which Luke matched with his own golden variety. Both Red and Luke prepared to attack the human projectile that was the Lord. That ended up being pointless too, as Jill appeared behind the two of them. She teleported them again, this time she just moved them so that they would be beside the man rather than in front of him. The old man couldn't do much to respond as both Luke and Red attacked him. The golden flames clashed with the black ones, and the man's veins burst as Red's blood pierced his skin. The man tumbled to the side, rolling against the ground. He quickly pushed himself to his feet and jumped at Jill. He had realized who was making the fight difficult, but he would have had a better chance of hitting the stars. Jill was already on the opposite side of the battlefield, and Robert instead jumped the man. Robert was surrounded by fire much like his father, though his fires were colored normally. The pure flame clashed with the black one as Robert ignored the damage to attack his father. Mash was tempted to help, but Jill appeared before him and held her palm towards him. He felt a strong desire to ignore the gesture and realized that his pride was overwhelming him. Dismissing his transformation, he listened as she spoke quickly, all the while watching the fight. Edward asked to let him, and his brother handle it for now. Let's give them the chance, I think they need it. Mash nodded watching as Edward ran behind his father, floating metal swords spiraling around him. His father yelled and the fire pulsed out from him, and the wounds he had sustained seemed to be healing. Edward ignored the fire, forming a clone in front of him to block the blow. He didn't give his father the chance to heal. He grabbed one of the floating blades and swung it with extreme precision. An obviously smooth and practiced strike, it seemed to part the flames as it cut through his father's arm. It sliced through his ribs too, and the arm fell to the ground. The old man seemed stunned for a second, before looking at his son. Mash could have sworn he saw a bit of pride in that gaze. The old man wasn't done yet and reached towards Edward with his good hand. His back was turned towards Robert though, and a flaming fist punched through his chest. The Lord didn't even look down at the wound, instead resting his hand atop Edward's shoulder. He said something, but it was too quiet for Mash to hear. A second later, Robert tore his hand out of his father's chest. The old man's body fell towards Edward, who grabbed it and slowly lowered it to the ground. He never really had a chance, the man was too old to handle his much more capable children. At this point, both Edward and Robert were shedding tears. In the distance Mash could make out other people. They had finally noticed what was happening. The whole fight had only lasted a few minutes if that, and most people wouldn't even know that there had been a fight. Although they would catch on pretty quickly. The ground had been ruined, and the building had a hole in it. Not to mention the twins clutching their dead father. Mash started walking towards the twins, though he stopped when he felt something shift in his domain. A second later the world shifted, and he was surrounded by darkness.